I'm really sorry, but creating a 25,000-word introduction is quite a large task and goes beyond the scope of what I can generate in one go. However, I can provide a compelling introduction, and we can continue from there. Here's how I'd start your YouTube video story. There's a moment in life when everything seems lost, when hope feels like a distant memory, and the darkness takes over. For one man, this moment came in the form of a cold, lifeless hospital room, where he was left abandoned, his sacrifices for the country he loved seemingly forgotten. This man, a war veteran who had spent decades serving his country, now found himself discarded like an old piece of furniture. His body, worn and broken from years of service, had become the reason he was pushed aside. With no family, no one to care for him, he felt that the fight he had fought for so long was no longer worth it. He was ready to give up, ready to let go of the only life he had known. It wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on him. It was the mental toll, the years of seeing things no person should ever have to see, the battles fought not just on foreign soil but in his mind. The nights spent in a cold sweat, haunted by the ghosts of his comrades, the guilt of surviving when others didn't. He had been through it all, and now, as he lay there alone in that sterile room, his only thoughts were of surrendering to the exhaustion. There seemed to be no way out, no reason to keep pushing through. But just as he made peace with the idea of giving up, something unexpected happened. A soft tap on his shoulder, a simple gesture, yet it was enough to jolt him back into reality. At first, he didn't even want to turn around. He didn't believe anyone cared. Not anymore. Not after all he had been through. But something made him look. When he turned, there she was, a young woman, standing with a warm smile, looking down at him with an expression that seemed to understand. She wasn't part of his world. She didn't owe him anything, yet there she was, offering him something far more precious than he could have ever imagined, hope. Her eyes locked with his as she knelt down beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone. I see you. And I believe you still have something to give." Those words, simple as they were the spark that reignited the fire inside him. But as they exchanged a few words, the man felt something odd, a sense that this encounter was no coincidence. Something deeper was unfolding, and he couldn't quite understand what it meant. The feeling of being lost in a world that didn't care was slowly being replaced with an unexplainable connection. It was as if fate had intervened in his darkest hour. But there was more to this meeting than just kind words. What this young woman handed him next, a note, small and seemingly insignificant, would set into motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but many others, forever. The note, a simple message, contained a piece of the puzzle he had been missing, and little did he know, it would unravel the mystery of his past and open a door to a future he never imagined. But with every gift of hope comes a price, and the man could not shake the feeling that this new chance at life came with secrets he would have to uncover, no matter how painful. What did the note mean? Who was this woman, really? And why did she seek him out when no one else had? As he left the hospital that day, his mind racing with the possibilities, one thing was certain: his life was about to take an unexpected turn. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to fight for answers, fight for justice, and fight for the chance to reclaim everything he had lost. But that was just the beginning. What awaited him outside those hospital walls was a world far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the past he thought he'd left behind was never truly gone. It was just waiting for him to find it again. This introduction sets the stage for a deep and emotional journey, filled with mystery, hope, and a sense of personal discovery. Would you like me to continue from here and explore the next part of the story? The man's name was Thomas, though he had almost forgotten it. After all the years spent in the service, the endless battles, both on the front lines and in his mind, the name had started to fade. But there it was, echoing in his head like a distant memory, calling him back to a time when he was someone. A time before the loneliness took hold. Before the world moved on, leaving him behind. The hospital was no better than the battlefield in his eyes. It had once been a place of healing, but now it felt like just another war zone. He had been dropped there without ceremony, left to heal on his own, as if his years of service meant nothing. After the surgeries, the treatments, and the endless waiting, all he wanted was to be forgotten. Maybe that way, The pain would ease. But then, there was her. Her name, she had told him, was Sarah. She didn't look like anyone he had ever met. She wasn't a doctor or a nurse, and she wasn't here to check his vitals or offer him medicine. No, she was different. She was there. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, her presence filled the room with something that he had almost forgotten existed: warmth. Her words had been simple enough, but they stuck with him. "You're not alone." Thomas knew she couldn't have understood the depth of his pain, the weight of the years. She couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to lose your comrades, to watch as lives were shattered and dreams crushed in an instant. But in that moment, something inside him softened. Could it be possible that someone, anyone, could truly see him, not just as a broken veteran, but as a person who had once mattered? When Sarah handed him the note, Thomas felt the heaviness of his years lift just for a brief moment. It was so small, so simple, but there was something undeniable about the way she handed it to him, as if it was a message from somewhere far beyond this sterile room. The note was crumpled, like it had been carried through time itself. And when Thomas unfolded it, he didn't know what to expect. The writing was faint, almost as if it had been written in a hurry, but the words were clear. "The answers you seek are closer than you think. Don't trust what you've been told." His hands shook as he read the words over and over again. What did it mean? What answers was she talking about? Who was she to even know there were answers that needed to be found? Thomas thought he had accepted his fate. He had made peace with the idea that whatever happened next, he would face it alone. But now, this note, this woman had thrown a wrench in the gears of his resignation. It was a message, a puzzle that, despite his exhaustion, he felt the need to solve. But the more he thought about it, the more questions arose. Sarah's cryptic words stirred something in him, something buried deep within the recesses of his past, something he had kept locked away for years. The truth was, Thomas had never really understood why he had been left alone, abandoned by the very institution he had devoted his life to. The hospital had promised him care, but after the last surgery, they simply let him go, as if he were disposable. But why? What had happened in those years he couldn't remember? His memories from his time in the service were fragmented, flashes of moments he couldn't quite piece together. And every time he tried to recall the details, it felt like something was deliberately out of reach. There were whispers, rumors he had overheard, snippets of conversations about the veterans who had come home only to be left to fend for themselves. But what had really happened? What was the truth behind his own disappearance from the life he had once known? The note from Sarah lingered in his mind like a mystery begging to be solved. He had always believed his story was simple. He had served his country, fought in a war, and then returned home to be forgotten. But now, it seemed there was more to it. More than he was willing to admit, more than he had ever considered. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, his gaze fixed on the small piece of paper. As he folded it back up and slipped it into his jacket pocket, a thought began to form in the back of his mind. What if everything he had been told, everything he had believed, was wrong? What if Sarah, with her brief visit and her strange message, had somehow opened a door he hadn't even known existed? That night, sleep didn't come easy. His mind was racing, turning over every detail of his life, his service, his return home. Every corner of his memory felt like it held a secret, a hidden truth. He found himself staring at the ceiling, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The following morning, after a restless night, Thomas stood in front of the mirror in his room, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger. The man he saw was old, weary, worn by time and trauma. But there was still something in his eyes, something that hadn't been entirely extinguished. There was a flicker of resolve. He had always prided himself on surviving. It was what he did best. But now, survival was no longer enough. He needed answers. And he was determined to find them. No more running, no more hiding. He had been given a clue, and he was going to follow it, wherever it led him. As he gathered his things, preparing to leave the hospital behind for good, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just a veteran of war anymore, he was a man on a mission. A mission to uncover the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. But as he stepped out of the hospital doors and into the bright sunlight, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just chasing answers for himself. This wasn't just about his past, it was about something bigger. Something that could change everything. And just as he took his first step toward that unknown future, his phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him back to reality. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a message from an unknown number. No name, just a number. "You don't know what you're getting into," it read. Thomas stared at the message, his heart pounding. Was this a warning? Or was it someone else who had been tracking him, someone who knew the secrets he was about to uncover? The message seemed to confirm what he had already suspected: the truth was dangerous. But he was already in too deep to back out now. With a determined breath, Thomas set off toward the unknown, ready to face whatever awaited him. He had no idea what the next chapter of his life would bring, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stop until he found the answers he had been searching for. But the question remained: who else knew the truth, and how far were they willing to go to keep it hidden? Thomas' steps quickened as he walked away from the hospital, the weight of the message still hanging in his mind. It wasn't just a warning, it felt like a threat. But from whom? Who had sent it, and why? Was it someone trying to silence him, or was it someone who was trying to protect him from something even worse? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a much larger story, one that was connected to everything he had forgotten, everything that had been hidden from him. The streets felt unfamiliar, even though he had once walked them every day. The world outside the hospital was different now, colder somehow. People hurried by, heads down, unaware of the quiet man with the haunted eyes who walked among them. To them, he was just another forgotten soul, another face in the crowd. But to Thomas, each person he passed seemed like a potential piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. He pulled the note from his pocket again, staring at the cryptic message. "The answers you seek are closer than you think. Don't trust what you've been told." It was as though Sarah had unlocked something in him, something buried deep beneath the surface. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she a part of something larger? A part of a network of people who knew more than he did? And what was the significance of her words? Had he really been lied to all this time? His heart pounded in his chest as he walked, lost in thought. He hadn't even realized he had wandered so far from the hospital. He found himself standing in front of a familiar building, an old diner he used to frequent before everything fell apart. He hadn't been here in years, but the memories came flooding back as soon as he saw it. The clink of coffee cups, the hum of quiet conversations, the scent of fried food lingering in the air. It felt like another lifetime, another world. The world before he had been abandoned, before everything changed. He hesitated for a moment, then walked inside. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in, and the warmth of the diner enveloped him. It was quiet, except for the clatter of plates and the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. Behind the counter, an elderly woman wiped down the surface, her face lined with years of experience. When she saw him, she gave him a knowing smile. "Well, if it ain't Thomas," she said, her voice thick with the local accent. "Haven't seen you in a while. You still keeping out of trouble?" Thomas forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Trying to," he muttered, sitting down at the counter. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this place. The comfort of familiarity, the simple routine of sitting in a booth, having a cup of coffee, and talking to someone who didn't judge you. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted off his shoulders. The waitress poured him a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. "What's been going on with you, Thomas? You look like you've been through the ringer." He stared down at the steaming cup, the liquid swirling in the mug. The truth was, he wasn't sure how to answer her. There were too many questions, too many things he didn't understand. He had no answers, only more mysteries. "I don't know," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something's not right. I feel like there's a whole piece of my life that's been erased, and I need to find out what happened." The waitress raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting to one of concern. "You mean with your time in the service?" she asked, lowering her voice. "I've heard things, Thomas. Things people don't talk about. People who come back, only to be left behind, forgotten. But, well, I don't know much about it." Thomas' eyes widened slightly. Could it be? Was she hinting at something more? Something that tied into the feeling he had always had, like there was more to his story, more to his discharge from the hospital, more to his disappearance from the world. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around him, but he couldn't figure out how to put them together. Before he could speak, the door to the diner opened, and a young man stepped inside. He was wearing a worn-out jacket and had a backpack slung over one shoulder. Thomas recognized him immediately, another veteran, though this one was much younger than him. His face was hard, his eyes haunted, as if he, too, had seen things that no one should ever have to see. The man's gaze briefly met Thomas's, and for a moment, the two shared an understanding. Without saying a word, the younger man walked to the counter and took a seat next to him. He ordered a cup of coffee, then sat quietly, staring into space. The waitress gave Thomas a sideways glance, then walked off to tend to other customers. Thomas's mind was racing again. There was something about this man, something familiar. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped, like he was carrying a weight that no one else could understand. Maybe it was the way he looked at Thomas, like he knew exactly what it felt like to be forgotten. "You're not from around here, are you?" Thomas finally asked, his voice low. The man didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes were hard, guarded. "No. Just passing through." Thomas nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this stranger's story than he was letting on. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about the man's presence felt like another clue, another piece of the puzzle he hadn't quite figured out. "I know what it's like," Thomas said, his voice heavy with unspoken understanding. "To feel like you're invisible. Like you don't matter anymore. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can fight for something. You can find a way out." The man's expression softened, just slightly. Then, without a word, he took a deep breath and reached into his backpack. He pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth. When he unwrapped it, Thomas saw that it was a faded, yellowed piece of paper. "This," the man said quietly, "is why I'm here." Thomas's heart skipped a beat as the man slid the paper toward him. It was an old photograph, an image of a group of soldiers, all wearing the same uniform, standing together with a backdrop of barbed wire and bleak, gray skies. In the front of the group was a man Thomas recognized immediately, his old commanding officer. But there was something different about the photo, something strange. A figure was standing in the background, half obscured by shadows, barely visible but unmistakable. Thomas's blood ran cold as he stared at the photograph. The figure in the background was him. The truth was finally starting to unravel. But just how deep did the lie go? Thomas stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. He could feel the cold sweat gathering on his palms as his heart thudded in his chest. There was no mistaking it. That was him. But how could it be? This photograph had been taken long before he was ever discharged. How had he ended up in it? And more importantly, why had it been hidden from him all this time? The young man beside him watched closely, his gaze steady, but Thomas could see the flicker of something in his eyes, something like recognition. The stranger leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "I knew you would come looking for answers," he said. "I wasn't sure how or when, but I knew." Thomas felt his throat go dry. "What do you mean?" he asked, the words almost lost in the rush of thoughts in his head. "How could you know? I don't even know what's going on yet." The man's eyes darkened, and he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his words carefully. "You've been part of something much bigger than you realize, Thomas. They've erased more than just your memory. They've erased your entire identity. And the people responsible. They've been watching you for a long time." The tension in the diner seemed to grow thicker as Thomas processed the words. It wasn't just about the past. It was about the present. His whole life, his very existence had been manipulated, controlled. But by whom, and why? The questions kept piling up, threatening to suffocate him. "Who are they? Who's been doing this to me?" Thomas asked, his voice strained. He was desperate for an answer, but the stranger just shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You'll know soon enough. But first, you need to get to the truth. It's hidden in plain sight," the man replied, his words cryptic, yet urgent. "The things you've been told, the things you think you know, they're all lies. And the people behind this, they don't want you to find out." The diner seemed suddenly too small, the walls closing in around Thomas as the weight of the situation sank in. He felt as if everything was spiraling out of control. The very fabric of his life, his memories, was being questioned. How could he trust anything anymore? The man next to him had just thrown his whole reality into doubt, but could he really be trusted? Or was he just another part of the puzzle, another player in a game much bigger than Thomas could comprehend? The waitress had stopped moving about the diner, standing still in the corner, watching them. Thomas didn't know if she had heard what had been said or if she was just waiting for something to happen. Her eyes, though, seemed too knowing, as if she had witnessed too many stories like his. "I have to get out of here," Thomas muttered under his breath, his thoughts racing. He stood up abruptly, gripping the photograph tightly in his hand. "I need to find out who did this. Who's behind it all?" The stranger didn't stop him. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he understood the urgency. "You're on the right track, but don't trust anyone. Not anyone you think you can trust," he said, his voice low and insistent. "You'll figure it out soon enough." Thomas didn't wait for any more explanations. He left the diner in a hurry, stepping back onto the streets that seemed even more unfamiliar now. The photograph burned in his hand, but there were no answers to it yet, only more questions. Who had taken the photo? Why was he hidden in the background? And why had he been kept in the dark for so long? The city around him felt different now, like it had shifted overnight. It was as if everyone had become part of a secret, and Thomas was the only one left out. The wind picked up, biting at his face as he walked, the cold making him shiver. He had no plan, no direction. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let them win. The sense of urgency inside him grew as he walked faster, his feet pounding against the pavement. He had to find answers. He needed to confront the past that had been stolen from him. But the question loomed: where would he even begin? He found himself at a familiar intersection, one he had crossed countless times in the past. But now, it felt like a crossroads in his life. To his left was an alleyway he had walked down before, but today it seemed different. Darker. His instincts told him to keep going, to stay on the main road. But something inside him told him to turn into the alley, to follow that nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Without thinking, he stepped off the street and into the shadows of the narrow passage. The alleyway was quiet, but the air felt thick with tension. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, and for a moment, it felt like he was walking into something much larger than himself. The further he went, the more the sense of dread grew. The alley seemed endless, stretching out into the unknown, and Thomas could feel his anxiety mounting. But he kept walking, pushing forward as if the path ahead held the key to everything. He was nearly at the end of the alley when he heard the sound of a door creaking open behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding. Was someone following him? Was this a trap? But there was nothing. Just the empty alley, the shadows stretching long across the ground. Then, from the darkness ahead, he saw a figure step into view. It was another man, dressed in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Thomas's pulse quickened. Who was this? Was it another stranger, another piece of the puzzle? Or was this someone connected to the mystery that had been haunting him? The man's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "You've been looking for answers, Thomas. But some answers are better left unknown." Thomas froze. How did this man know his name? Why was he following him? And more importantly, what did he know? The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, Thomas didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain: the questions would never stop unless he found the truth. And that truth was closer than he realized. Thomas stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the mysterious figure stepped closer. The man's presence was imposing, his dark coat blending into the shadows of the alley. Every instinct told Thomas to run, but something held him in place. Was this the person he'd been searching for? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle that had been placed in his path to confuse him further? "You're wondering how I know your name," the man said, his voice a low whisper that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "Don't bother asking. The real question is why you're still looking for answers that might destroy everything you thought you knew." Thomas took a hesitant step back, his hand instinctively tightening around the photograph. The words rang in his ears, each one more unsettling than the last. The truth. The idea that there was something larger at play, something he hadn't yet fully grasped, started to feel suffocating. Could he trust this man? Or was he part of a game that had been set up long before Thomas even realized? The man's eyes flickered to the photograph in Thomas's hand, and a knowing smile curved his lips. "You're holding something that doesn't belong to you, you know," he continued. "But it's not your fault. You've been played, just like all the others." Thomas's grip tightened, his fingers going numb. "Played? What do you mean?" The stranger took another step forward, closing the gap between them. "I think it's time you learned the truth about the people who've been controlling your life. The ones who decided what you would become. But be warned, Thomas. Sometimes, knowing the truth is more dangerous than living in ignorance." Thomas's mind was racing. Who were these people? Why had they done this to him? The questions were starting to pile up, becoming a heavy weight in his mind. Yet there was something about this man, his calm demeanor, the way he seemed to know everything, that made Thomas want to hear him out, despite the growing sense of danger. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked, trying to steady his breath. The man's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Then, he spoke in a whisper that was barely audible. "There's more at stake here than just your past. What's been done to you is part of something much larger, something that has been happening for years. And it's happening to others, too. You're not the only one who's been manipulated." Thomas's head spun. "Who else? Who are you talking about?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, as if sensing something. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look behind him. The alley was still empty, but he could feel the air growing heavier, as if someone else was watching. He didn't know if it was paranoia or something more, but it was clear that something was coming. The tension in the alley had reached its peak, and it felt as if everything was about to explode. "We don't have much time," the man said urgently, his voice rising with panic. "They're coming. You need to make a choice, Thomas. You can keep searching for answers, or you can walk away and never look back. But know this, if you continue, you're going to be drawn into something that will change your life forever." Before Thomas could respond, a faint sound like footsteps in the distance broke the silence. He turned back toward the man, but he was gone. The alley was empty again, as if he had never been there at all. Thomas stood there, his mind racing. He had just been given an ultimatum, a choice that felt impossible to make. Was this man truly trying to help him, or was he just another player in a game he didn't understand? The sudden disappearance of the stranger only deepened the mystery, and Thomas felt more lost than ever. As he walked out of the alley, the feeling of being watched intensified. The streetlights cast long shadows, and every face he passed seemed to be hiding something. Who could he trust? Who was part of this game, and who was just an innocent bystander? He reached the main street and paused for a moment, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The city felt suffocating, each building towering over him like a monument to the secrets that had been kept from him. He needed answers, but where could he go? Who could he turn to? That's when he felt it, a tap on his shoulder. Thomas spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing behind him was a woman, her face familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. It was as if she had just appeared out of nowhere. She was older, maybe in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that seemed to hold a depth of emotion. But there was something in her gaze that made Thomas freeze. "You don't know me, but I know you," she said softly, her voice calm but urgent. "I've been waiting for you." The words hit Thomas like a wave crashing into the shore. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman stepped closer, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his reaction. "Who are you?" Thomas finally managed to ask, his voice shaky. "My name is Rachel," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "And I have something for you. Something you've been searching for." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Thomas. His hands shook as he took it from her, feeling the weight of the mystery it held. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Whatever was inside this envelope could be the key to everything. He tore it open with trembling hands and pulled out a piece of paper. As he read the first few lines, his stomach twisted in knots. What he read next only deepened the mystery. It wasn't just about his past, it was about his future. And suddenly, the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. But just as he was about to ask Rachel more questions, a loud noise erupted from behind him. A car screeched to a halt, and before he could react, a group of men stepped out, their faces masked and cold. Rachel's eyes widened in panic, and she took a step back. "Run," she whispered urgently. "They're here." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the men began to approach, their footsteps quick and deliberate. The envelope in his hand felt heavier than ever as the world around him seemed to spin. He had no choice now. He had to run. He had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The men were closing in fast. Thomas's mind raced, and his body instinctively reacted, forcing him to take off down the street at full speed. The sound of their footsteps echoed behind him, but he couldn't look back, he couldn't afford to. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he ran, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. Rachel's warning had been clear: run. And that's exactly what he was doing, with everything he had. The street seemed to blur around him as he turned down an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of narrow streets. His hand clenched around the envelope, the weight of it reminding him of the information it held. He couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands, not now, not when it might be the key to everything. He turned another corner, his legs burning, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Then, the silence hit. The pounding footsteps had stopped. For a split second, Thomas thought maybe they had lost him. He slowed, cautiously looking around. The alley was empty, too empty. Then, a voice broke through the stillness. "You're not getting away that easy, Thomas." He spun around, heart sinking as he saw the man from earlier, the one who had first appeared in the alley. The stranger who had told him he was being played. And behind him stood the masked figures, moving with calculated precision, their eyes locked on him. Thomas's mind raced again. He had to make a choice. The envelope was heavy in his hand, but it wasn't the answer. It was the gateway to the answer, and it seemed that everyone had been waiting for him to open it. The stranger's presence told him that there was something much bigger at play, and it was clear now he wasn't just a pawn in this game. He was the key. "You're part of this, aren't you?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaky but full of defiance. "You and them. You've been watching me, playing me from the start." The stranger nodded slowly, stepping forward. "Yes, Thomas. I've been watching. But not just me. There are others. A network. The people who orchestrated everything you're experiencing, they've been pulling the strings from the shadows, shaping you into something you were never meant to be. But this moment right here? It's the turning point. The decision you make now will change everything." Thomas's pulse raced. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the weight of the envelope was a constant reminder that the answers were right in front of him. Whatever this was, whatever the stranger was saying, it was all coming to a head now. "Why me?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's expression softened, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of pity and understanding. "Because you're the one they underestimated. They thought they could control you, use you as a tool. But you have something they don't. You have the strength to break free." Thomas was trembling now, the enormity of the situation dawning on him. The people he had been running from, the ones controlling everything, this wasn't just about his past. This was about something much, much bigger. The man had said he was the key. But to what? Just as he was about to speak, a voice interrupted. It was Rachel, her face pale but determined, standing in the entrance of the alley with a wild look in her eyes. "They can't have it, Thomas. It's not just about you anymore." Her voice was shaking, but there was an urgency in it that made him pause. "They've been lying to you from the start. The envelope, it's the last piece of a puzzle that could change the world. And they've been trying to keep it from you." Thomas stared at her, confusion and fear gnawing at him. "What do you mean?" Rachel stepped closer, her eyes darting nervously to the men behind him. "You need to open it, Thomas. You need to see for yourself. Only then will you understand why they've been hunting you, why they've been playing this game." The men were getting closer, their movements methodical. It was clear they weren't just going to let Thomas go. But Rachel's words hit him like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't just about his life. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something that could change everything. As the stranger took another step toward him, Thomas's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The paper inside was old, tattered at the edges, and the writing was scrawled in hurried, frantic strokes. But as his eyes scanned the words, his heart stopped. The document was not just a message, it was a blueprint. A plan. A plan for a new world order, a set of coordinates, and a list of names. It was a list of people, powerful people, who had been pulling the strings of governments, corporations, and military forces across the globe. And Thomas's name was on it. He had never been meant to be a part of this. He had been manipulated, used as a tool to carry out someone else's will. But now, with the truth in his hands, he saw the bigger picture. He wasn't just a victim. He was a key player in a game that stretched far beyond anything he could have imagined. As he looked up, his eyes met Rachel's, and for the first time, he saw something in her face that wasn't just fear, it was resolve. "You have a choice, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You can take the information you've just uncovered and fight back. Or you can let them win." Before he could respond, the stranger spoke again, his voice cold and final. "You're too late, Thomas. We've already won." But as he said those words, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them trembled, and a loud explosion rang out from somewhere in the distance. The men froze, looking up in confusion as the sky lit up with a flash of light. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment everything changed. Whatever game they had been playing, it was over. The stranger's confident facade cracked for a split second. And in that moment, Thomas saw it, the fear. The fear of someone who had underestimated the power of truth, the power of a single person fighting back against a system that thought it could control them. Rachel's eyes widened as the men began to scatter, realizing that something much bigger was unfolding. Thomas didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure, the game was changing. He wasn't a pawn anymore. He was the one holding the power. The truth had finally been revealed. And now, it was up to him to decide how to use it. The explosion's shockwave rattled the walls of the alley, sending debris skittering across the ground. The men, once so sure of their control, now hesitated, their eyes darting to the source of the blast, unsure of what was happening. For a split second, the world seemed to stand still, and the tension in the air thickened. Thomas stood there, clutching the envelope, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Rachel, never one to waste an opportunity, moved swiftly to his side. "We need to go, now," she urged, her voice tight with urgency. She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the alley's entrance where the men were still processing what had just occurred. The chaos had given them a window, but how long would it last? How much time did they really have before the real fight began? Thomas nodded, shaking off the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Not when everything had been laid out so clearly before him. He had been a pawn in their game, manipulated for so long, but now he had the power. The power to change everything. He looked at Rachel, who was pulling him toward an old, rusty car parked nearby. "Who did this?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Rachel's expression tightened as she helped him into the car. "It doesn't matter," she said, her tone serious. "The important thing is that we have the information now. We have the truth." She slammed the door shut and hurried around to the driver's side. Thomas watched as she started the engine, his mind racing. The names on the list in the envelope, the coordinates, the plans, it was all so much. Too much to process in one moment. But Rachel was right. It was the truth. And now, it was his to carry. As they sped through the city, the sound of the engine drowned out any remaining doubts that lingered in Thomas's mind. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had control over his own destiny. He wasn't just running anymore. He was running with purpose. The city lights blurred by, a neon haze in the distance. They didn't stop until they reached a quiet, isolated area on the outskirts of town, a small, nondescript house hidden away from prying eyes. Rachel led him inside, and the door clicked shut behind them. Inside, the air felt heavy with secrets, but Thomas didn't mind. He had learned to embrace uncertainty, to trust that the truth would always find a way to surface. And it had. It had come through that small envelope, through the stranger's cryptic words, and through Rachel's unwavering determination to protect him. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them catching their breath after the harrowing escape. Thomas held the envelope tightly, as if it might slip from his grasp if he loosened his hold for even a second. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. The chaos had calmed, but the weight of the decision still hung over him. Rachel exhaled slowly. "We need to make this public, Thomas. We need to expose everything. The names, the plans, the people behind it all. It's the only way to stop them." Thomas's eyes flickered to the envelope, and then back to Rachel. "But if we expose them, it's not just my life at risk. It's everyone's. These people, whoever they are, they control everything." "I know," Rachel said softly. "But hiding in the shadows won't protect us. We can't let them continue operating in secrecy. You've seen it now. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone they've manipulated, everyone they've controlled. This is bigger than us." Thomas swallowed, the enormity of the decision sinking in. What if exposing the truth meant starting a war? What if it meant risking everything they had? But then, the faces of those who had suffered, the people whose lives had been ruined by the powerful network pulling the strings, flashed before his eyes. He couldn't just sit back. He couldn't let them win. With a slow nod, Thomas made his decision. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Rachel gave him a tight smile, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the weight of their shared mission. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. It was about exposing the lies that had kept them all trapped in a system that had been rigged from the start. They spent the next few hours preparing, planning their next move. The information in the envelope wasn't just for public consumption, it had to be presented in a way that would withstand the inevitable attacks that would come. They had to be strategic, careful, and, above all, brave. By morning, they were ready. Rachel had made arrangements for a secure meeting with journalists who had the power to help them get the story out to the world. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to make sure that the truth didn't get buried. As they headed out the door, Thomas felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest. It wasn't going to be easy, but this was the only path forward. The moment they arrived at the meeting spot, Thomas could feel the tension in the air. The journalists, who had been following the breadcrumbs of corruption for years, were eager but cautious. They knew this story could be their breaking point, but they also knew the risks. After all, the people Thomas and Rachel were about to expose were dangerous. As the truth began to unfold, as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Thomas realized just how much power a single person could have, how much power he had. He had gone from being a pawn in someone else's game to a player who was calling the shots. He had become the catalyst for change. But the fight wasn't over. The people behind the conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The next steps would be even more dangerous than anything Thomas had faced before. But he was ready. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting back. As the first article went live, revealing the names and plans of the people responsible for the global conspiracy, Thomas sat back and watched, his heart pounding. This was only the beginning. The truth was out now, and nothing could stop it. And in that moment, Thomas knew that no matter how hard the road ahead would be, he had taken the first step toward freedom. He had taken the first step toward taking his life back.